and welcome everyone. What looks like to be a really interesting topic, I think, today. So we're really looking forward to hearing from you, and thanks for being here on your visit. So Father Cyril, or Archimandrite Cyril, is a professor of ecclesiology, international relations and ecumenism, and he's also director of the Huffington Ecumenical Institute at Loyola Marymount University, Los Angeles. Three of us were together in the Czech Republic a couple of years ago for a conference, so which was a great time. So it's great to have you here in Australia. So Father Cyril is going to speak on Orthodox political theologies. So I'll let you speak for however long you like, and then we'll open up to questions and discussion.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you. Many thanks to those who have contributed to organizing this seminar. You, Joel, first, Sister Beruta. Father Lawrence was supposed to be here, but unfortunately he could not join us. Thank you for coming. And I'm going to talk about a ghost, something that doesn't exist, or at least something which is not recognized in the Orthodox Church, because there is like a tendency to consider political theology as something unorthodox, as something Western, heretical, and therefore not applicable to orthodoxy. That was, for example, the point of Christos Yanaras, one of the most prominent Orthodox political theologians. He was really the number one. And as a number one, he said, political theology is anathema. It cannot be orthodox. And the paradox of him is that, well, first of all, he was really a great theologian, Greek theologian. He never said he's a theologian. He was a great political theologian. He never acknowledged political theology as a legitimate field. Only recently, the Orthodox began kind of acknowledging there is such a thing as Orthodox political theology. Moreover, I discovered that actually we have invented it. Usually, Augustine is credited to be the father of the Christian political theology. I would argue that he was more a father of the Christian public theology. Public theology meaning the theology which focuses on the church-society relations, because he lived in the period of the collapse of the symphony in the West, and he, in his De Civitate Dei, he tried to kind of figure out how to live in this collapsing world, as you know, and how to establish some kind of relationship between the church and something which remained after the collapse of the empire. And that what remained, we could call kind of public square anyways. The true father of the Orthodox political theology, of the Christian political theology, I believe, was Eusebius of Caesarea. He is actually their father, the founder. In the sense of political theology, let me just jump to the scheme. That's how I differentiate public and political theology. So political theology has to do with mostly with the relation between the church and the state, while public theology has to do mostly with the relations between the church and society. So Augustine is the founder of the public theology, in my judgment. Eusebius is the father of the political theology, Christian political theology. Of course, political theology, Christian political theology goes even further to the earlier Christianity. Like, for example, the famous letter to Diognetus of the 2nd century could be seen as a sort of statement of political theology. To be open to the society, to be yourself, at the same time to be open to the society for the Christians. I believe it's one of the earliest statements of political theology. And of course, we all know that Augustine referred to Varro, the Roman intellectual who lived in the 1st century BC, and claimed that Varro elaborated on, invented political theology. And Augustine made this reference in the Civitate Dei. Well, Augustine was against Varro. He criticized Varro, which implied that he criticized Varro's political theology. But he himself, Augustine, eventually adopted a sort of political theology. It's basically a similar situation with Yanaras, who criticized political theology because it was Western, but he developed his own political theology, a very prominent one. Yes, Augustine was, I believe, really a father of public theology. In the Christian East, public theology was rudimentary because society was rudimentary. Even though the recent studies like by Haldelis, who argues that the Eastern Roman Empire was actually what we call Byzantium, misleadingly, was actually a republic, which is a good point. Then the sort of political theology that developed there could also be called public theology. I don't know. Well, I'm not here to argue against or for him, for his argument. But what I discovered, quite surprisingly to myself, I just stumbled on a text in Gregory Palamas. You probably know this kind of anti-Catholic, anti-Western, prominent Orthodox theologian whom we celebrated just last Sunday. Not a very ecumenical figure, but he and I just really stumbled on this phrase that he spoke about theandriki politia or politeia, whatever you preference, to application to Christ's life and to the life of the church. This is an interesting expression. Well, theandriki is a Christological term, as you know. It goes back to Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite, who called theandriki energia, that Christ acted in the theandric way. And politeia is a very interesting term that is corresponding to the Latin res publica. It's republic. It's not the state. It's something which is bigger than the state. And Gregory Palamas spoke about republic, politeia, as something which was not just, the emperor, not just something like the Senate or other institution of the Byzantine state. So we could say that he kind of implied some sort of public theology in his writings, even though he's not usually a person to be associated with any political or public theology. Which is another paradox. If we take, I mentioned Dionysius the Areopagite, who tried to stay away from politics as far as possible. As we know, he was absolutely, completely, convincingly apolitical. But he became the author of the most prominent political idea in the Christian world ever, the idea of hierarchy. That is Dionysian. Well, basically, this Neoplatonic, of course. But Dionysius then introduced it to, I would say, smuggled it to Christianity, and then a bunch of political theologians elaborated on it and developed all those sophisticated ideas about stratification of the church society and everything else, and God, of course, the divine being and divine realm, and connected those hierarchies together. But anyways, it's not just a remark. It's definitely not. In the Christian East, even though we had the guys like Gregory Palamas who made references to politeia, usually, of course, in the Christian East, they refer to Basileia, to the kingdom, to the state. The state was the main partner for the church. Therefore, the state inspired political theology, the sort of political theology which we had in the Christian East. And how it looked like political theology in the East can be depicted in this, was depicted, I believe, in this mosaic, famous mosaic in Ravenna in San Vitale. Of course, you can see Justinian here. You can see the hierarchs to our right, but actually to the left from Justinian, and then senators and military to his right. To explain this picture, I need to make a reference that for the first time, the word symphonia was used by Eusebius of Caesarea. But he never used this word symphonia in application to the state or to his beloved Constantine or to any political idea. For him, it was a biblical idea. It had to do with the biblical hermeneutics. Eusebius tried to, as you probably know, among many things that he tried to do, he was really kind of a multitasker. He tried to harmonize the kind of contradicting pieces of the stories from the Synoptic Gospels, right? And in order to do this, he applied the word symphonia. That was symphonia for him. Basically, it meant those evangelists who were synoptics, who looked in the same direction, had some differences, but there was basically a symphony between them. Now look at this picture. They look in the same direction, those guys, right? They're synoptics, we could say. Of course, they're not evangelists, but they look in the same direction. And some kind of symphonia harmony is implied between them, even though there are differences between them, just like between the synoptics. So I believe this is kind of almost a perfect picture of symphonia in the Eusebian sense, original biblical sense, and also in the kind of posterior political theologian sense. And this is an ideal, right? This is how kind of they imagine themselves, including Justinian. Basically, this is the idea of Justinian, which is embodied in his famous preamble to the sixth novella in his codex, where he used actually the word symphonia, consonantia in Latin. I think the original word was consonantia, the Latin, then the Greek translation for symphonia, in application now to basilia and hierosini and priesthood. So the partners, as they were envisaged in the sixth preamble and preamble of the sixth novella, was the partnership between basilia, not politia, not politeia, basilia, and hierosini, priesthood. Again, not the church as the body of Christ, not the church as as everyone, right? But a very particular part of the church, the clergy, kind of who were perceived as the church par excellence at the time already. So this is an ideal icon of symphony. The reality, of course, we know was much harsher. The reality was always that there were never a balance between the church and the state. The state usually tried to prevail and to dictate and crossed as many red lines as it wanted. Sometimes the church did the same. In the case, for example, of Michael Cerularius, the famous patriarch of Constantinople, who broke relations with Rome and anathematized the Pope and Cardinal Humbert, he actually tried to play the role of the emperor. Sometimes, you know, I bring this example to explain Putin and Kirill's relations, Patriarch Kirill's relations, because, well, Putin and Kirill present themselves as like this icon, symphonia, everything like in harmony. But in reality, of course, Putin wants the church to do some things that the church maybe is not supposed to do, right? It's a clear violation of symphonia. But Kirill envisages himself as Michael Cerularius, as someone who is smarter and more powerful and more capable, you know, than Putin. Basically, Kirill envisages himself as Ayatollah, you know, for Russia. That's why he sent this very good, very warm letters on the death of the late Ayatollah and on the election of the new one. So you see how the reality was that, like, yes, it was supposed to be beautiful and nice and symphonic, but the reality was that everyone tried to win. And usually the emperors won. Like this one, Roger II, a Norman barbarian in Sicily, who hated Byzantium, but he copied everything Byzantine, including this political theology, this theory. I took this picture in Santa Maria del Ammiraglio in Palermo, probably you know this one, which is actually, yes, it explains itself. But it also explains one very interesting idea and terminological nuance in the Byzantine political theology. In the East, they had two phrases for imago. There was imago Dei and there was imago Christi. So imago Dei is everyone, like we're all created in the image and likeness of Christ, of God. But the Byzantines made it very specific. Imago Christi applies only to the emperors. If you call yourself, I am Imago Christi, I am the image of Christ, you are a traitor potentially. You are a pretender. You are a usurper. You get killed. Because this term is applicable only to the emperor, just like, you know, walking or wearing purple clothes was only for the emperors. If you wear something purple, you get killed because you are an usurper. Well, Cerularius actually wore purple shoes. Imago Christi was the same point. A kind of Imago Christi is only the emperor, and you can see this on this mosaic of Roger II, Rogerius. Well, in contrast to the Western Church, in the East, in the Christian East, we most of our history we lived in the situation of Symphonia, in the situation of this kind of untiable bond between the church and the state. That is our historic memory. This is our identity, and you cannot undo it very easily after you've done it for centuries, for most of your history. So we keep doing this. Like here, this is like almost like an ideal picture of the Russian symphony. I mean, the photographer is a genius, to capture this kind of cross on the forehead of Putin. So how this hell has happened. Speaking about Kirill used to be, of course, Kirill's idea of Symphonia. You see, I jumped now from the Middle Ages to modern Russia because there is a similarity. If you even take the concept of Moscow the Third Rome, which is very medieval, it's like a bridge from the Middle Ages to our time. And this is really one of a few medieval rudiments that actually have become very prominent in the modern setting. Because in the Middle Ages, everyone wanted to be Third Rome. Like, for example, less known is the case of, Veliko Tyrnovo in Bulgaria. It was one among the earliest cases of the Third Rome. That was their kind of original. The monks in Veliko Tyrnovo in the Bulgarian state, they called Veliko Tyrnovo the Third Rome, even prior to Moscow. So Moscow was a latecomer to this game of Third Romes when everyone tried to be the Third Rome, and there was like the kind of the world, the game of the thrones, right, of the Third Rome, a competition. So it was smuggled here, and how it became possible. That's the thing. Kirill, as I knew him, because probably maybe you know that I worked with him for 10 years. I was kind of his theological secretary very closely. I have his name, actually. So I belong to his inner circle, and I saw the dynamics of changes with him. So he started as a very open-minded, very progressive, I would say one of the most liberal hierarchs in the Orthodox Church. And that is the thing, that all the top hierarchs in the Russian Orthodox Church, they were liberals, always. But they played a game of conservatives. All of them pretended to be conservatives. But inside, deep inside, all of them were liberals. No exceptions. Like, I knew Alexei II, the previous patriarch. He was super liberal inside, but he appeared to be like this kind of mandarin, very conservative. And Kirill actually was liberal, but he did not pretend to be conservative at the time. He actually showed himself as a very liberal, open-minded hierarch. He actually read the best stuff when he could read. Actually, he tried to read, I should say, and I tested the most liberal theologians of his time. He was inspired by them, and then he became what he became here. So the question is how this became possible, and that's the second part of my presentation that I'd like to dedicate to. So basically, the Orthodox political theology, we differentiate two tracks. The one track that seeks to develop distinctively Orthodox political theology without naming it political theology. It tries to make it very confessional, anti-Western, usually anti-Catholic. Usually it is very anti-Catholic, this track. And the second track is much more ecumenical, in dialogue with the ideas from the West and stuff. Kirill belonged to the second track, definitely. He always was on the second track. And there was always a dialectics between the two tracks in the Orthodox political theology, at least since the ideas of the Enlightenment started to be smuggled to the Christian East in the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. And at that time in Greece became really a playground for this antagonism between the two tracks. I would identify this guy. His name is Athanasius of Paros. He was declared a saint by the Ecumenical Patriarchate as the guy who became really, he lived in the beginning of the 19th century, and he became very critical of all the ideas of enlightenment, all those ideas of freedom and things, and he developed a polemics, very distinct polemics against those ideas. And it is through this politics he developed a kind of political theology which represents, kind of encapsulates this first track of being very confessional, anti-Western, anti-Catholic, very anti-Catholic, by the way. And he opposed this guy, Adamantius Corey. Oops, sorry, it's not Athanasius of Paros. And obviously, it's Adamantius Corey. Sorry. I will correct immediately. Yeah. Horais. Yeah. So he's believed to be the father of the Greek Enlightenment. He's actually was on the most popular banknote in Greece, drachma, before it was substituted by euro. He was also not irrelevant to the church. Actually, he was sent to study in Montpellier, in France, with a scholarship by a Greek hierarch, a saint hierarch, who actually was the composer of Philokalia, Macarius Notaras, the Archbishop of Corinth, who actually put all those pieces together and composed Philokalia. He also sent with his money Correis to study medicine and theology to Montpellier. And Correis, imagine, with someone who had composed Philokalia, sent this guy to Greece, and this guy brought all the ideas of enlightenment and Westernization to Greece, became the most important figure in the Greek Enlightenment. And Athanasius of Paros just made him the arch enemy, just always bombarded him with his, with his accusations and ideas. So that was kind of the earliest stage of the modern antagonism between the two approaches to political theology in the Orthodox milieu. And continued in Russia with the conflict between the so-called Westerners and Slavophiles. Westerners who believed that, Russia first did not have its own history, proper history. It belongs to the West, and its meaning that the raison d'être is where of Russia belongs to the West. One of them was, for example, Peter Chadaev, who was also a sort of theologian, and he was super ecumenical at the time. He wanted the unity of the churches, Orthodox and Catholic churches, very much in the beginning of the 19th century. Well, of course, he ended up in a madhouse under Nicholas I. They just sent him to, declared him crazy and sent him to a madhouse. But he was one of the main figures among the Westerners and the Slavophiles. The Slavophiles who argue that, well, Russia has a special role, a special mission in the world, and a special kind of path. And this path was always anti-Western, anti-Catholic. Among the most prominent figures among them was, of course, it will come. Khomyakov, of course. Khomyakov, who developed his ecclesiology, distinct ecclesiology. He's considered to be the father of the Orthodox ecclesiology. And so they clashed. There was like this rupture between the two groups, but those two groups represented basically two tracks in political theology, because each group had its own political theology, without naming, of course, it political theology. Then this antagonism continued, and then we have these figures, Vladimir Solovyov, who is very important for the Russian Catholics, right, Sister Beruta? Yes. It's this network of the Russian Catholics, which actually is managed from Melbourne, right? So where is Melbourne? Where are the Russian Catholics? Well, there is a connection. So Solovyov is kind of the main figure in this group. And then Berdyaev, they definitely belong to the first track. Oh, sorry, to the second track, the track of the openness. Well, some people believe that Solovyov is probably the most prominent Orthodox political theologian of our times. This is the belief, for example, Teli Papanikolaou from Fordham University, who relies heavily on Vladimir Solovyov. And, we still don't know, probably Solovyov converted to Catholicism in the end of his life. There are no proofs, like 100% clear proofs, but there are kind of suspicions. And Berdyaev. This line of openness, of open political theology as well, was continued by Father Sergei Bulgakov. Well, the same line, this is the Russian milieu, even though they continued in the diaspora after they had to flee the Soviet Union. But then the Greeks had their own contributions to the second track. Like, for example, the earliest one was, for example, the encyclical of the Ecumenical Patriarchy published in 1920, very early. 1920, with an ecumenical appeal. It's one of the founding documents of the modern ecumenical movement, by the way. And it was produced here. This is the Church of St. George, which is the Cathedral of the Ecumenical Patriarchy, quite modest. For example, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Meletius Metaxas, was among the prominent figures in this sort of political theology. So this is the kind of track number 2, right? Open-minded, ecumenical, pro-Western, pro-Catholic, and so forth. And this is what I call the theology of the 20s. Well, the encyclical was published in 1920, and well, the Roaring 20s, kind of jazz era, also influenced theology and produced political theology. These guys, well, Solovyov died in 900. Berdyaev became very prominent in 1920s, but he continued through 1940s. So those guys, and the same as Bulgakov. So these guys, they kind of encapsulated the spirit of the 20s in the political theology. Then another spirit came to prevail. That was a spirit of reaction, the spirit of kind of, from track 2, which was open-minded, they were dragged, or they dragged others to track 1. And I believe among the prominent figures in this tendency was George Florovsky. Well, Florovsky declared himself to be apolitical, just like, Dionysius the Areopagite and, Sianaras and so forth, but he was deeply, profoundly political. I believe his neo-patristic synthesis is nothing more but a political theology. It's a political theology of reaction. It is not a radical reaction, but it is a reaction to the theology of the 20s. Florovsky used to be a Eurasianist. He belonged to this group of Eurasians who continued the Slavophiles. So they believed in the special mission of Russia, political mission of Russia. Then Florovsky had to leave this group. Well, it's unclear why he left. The noble explanation is that he became disappointed. The more pragmatic and cynical explanation that this group became disappointed in him and did not promote him enough as he believed. So he left anyways. And he declared, I'm done with you. Nothing in common with you. But I believe he continued to be Eurasian to a great extent. And this idea of pseudomorphosis that he developed, that everything in the Russian theology, like basically after Peter I, and primarily Ukraine, which was the kind of the core of evils, all evils, had happened because of this pseudomorphosis and these Western influences on the Orthodox, purely kind of this lake with clear water, which was muddied with these Western influences, and he called it pseudomorphosis. I believe his theology is pseudomorphosis itself. And he was basically. I have my points actually. It's another story. I can prove it. But basically, Florovsky encapsulated this spirit of the kind of the changing spirit of the 30s, which was now more into reaction to the liberal theologies, and this spirit reached its kind of height, or its lowest, in some theological figures who were super popular in that time, but are almost forgotten nowadays, like this one, Nikifor Krajnik. He was a Romanian theologian. Well, he was basically a fascist. And he has produced a fascist political theology, Orthodox fascist political theology, which is resurfacing now in Romania. He's becoming now, again, a very popular figure, being republished and appreciated by many. Well, yeah, that's another story, what is happening in the church. But anyways, for me, he really represented the spirit of the 30s, the new phase in the Orthodox political theology, which was kind of very reactionary, very conservative, to the point of being pro-fascist, fascist, and pro-Nazi, and even Nazi. We sometimes we acknowledge and we kind of study the role of the church and the input of the church to fascism, Nazis, to those big systems of kind of totalitarian systems of the interwar period. But sometimes we just don't notice in the shade of those big systems how kind of this orthodox microtumors of fascism flourished. Basically, almost every single Orthodox country in the interwar period was fascist or pro-fascist. Almost all of them, except the Soviet Union, which was kind of the opposite side of Nazism, of course. And this affiliation, this kind of affinity with fascism was backed by theology. So there were theologians who all the time always backed this tendency. A very interesting case is Nikolai Velimirovich, again, a saint, a Serbian saint. He is really, he's believed to be the saint, kind of the guy who stood to the spirit of the time, but he was always fluctuating in the spirit of the time. He always changed in tune with the time. In the 1910s and 1920s, he actually spent some time in the United States, and he fell in love with American democracy, and he began his writings and preachings actually by preaching and praising democracy as the pillar of two pillars for example, for his contemporary Serbian society. The Serbian is orthodoxy and democracy as two pillars, to flourish. That was his belief, and that's what he even preached. Then the 30s came, and in the 30s he became fascist, basically. Praising the dictatorship, the royal dictatorship which was established in Yugoslavia, in the Kingdom of Serbs in Yugoslavia, and he became. In the 40s, he even praised Hitler personally. It did not help him. He ended up in the Nazi concentration camps. He survived them. He was liberated by the Allies, and he went to the United States. And in the 50s, he began praising democracy again. So that is a very interesting case. The guy who said, "I deny the spirit of this time," he was always in tune with the spirit of the time in his political theology. Then, of course, the war happened. And after the war, many things changed. Well, Velimirovich changed his mind, right? After the war in the 50s. But then in the 60s, there were people like Savas Agoridis. Savas Agoridis is a prominent Greek theologian. He passed away relatively recently, but he was really prominent. And he encapsulated what I call the theology of the 60s. Aggiornamento kind of theology, which also affected the Orthodox milieu very much. And Agoridis was really one of the key figures in this aggiornamento thing. He criticized, he really hated everything Byzantine. He believed that Byzantium prevented us from, acknowledging human rights. He was very much for human rights. He was very much for, we need to be, in the spirit of the time. We need to be ecumenical. He was very much ecumenical. And I should say, this is my kind of testimony, personal testimony. When we had a conversation with Kirill of Moscow, he really appreciated Agoridis. That was one of his heroes. So you would be surprised by that. And then, of course, in diaspora, the same political theology of the 60s became prominent in the framework of Paris School, the so-called Paris School. This is Institut de Théologie Orthodoxe and Serge. Which is still kind of floating now, but not very prominently as it used to be. But basically, it was very, very close to. It became like a really an incubator of modern political theology. Most prominent political theologians studied there. And actually, it's interesting that it created like a spin, a momentum for Greek political theology of the 60s. Almost every single Greek political theologian after the war had some kind of relationship to Saint Serge. Like, for example, Yanaras. I even translated a chapter from his autobiography where he described his experience in Saint Serge. He did not study or teach there. He was in Sorbonne, but he was very much connected with Saint Serge, for example. And speaking about Yanaras started in the brotherhoods, the Greek brotherhoods, which received their prominence in the 1910s, 1920s. And in the spirit of the time, they were very open-minded. They were about evangelization of the Greek people, you know, good guys. But then, as the spirit of time changed, the brotherhoods also changed. The brotherhoods are primarily Zoe, the life. Later on, Sotir emerged after the crisis, internal crisis of the brotherhoods. And then, in the period of like in the 30s, 40s, the brotherhood started marching like this. They became really like quasi-fascist groups. This is from the book of Yanaras, Katafigio Idion, where he criticizes the brotherhoods from this perspective. Very excellent. I believe it's the best book of Yanaras, at least that I've read. There are a few ideas where it's kind of autobiographical, but basically he describes this transformation of the brotherhoods from, you know, evangelical in the good sense, to more political and dictatorial, you know, groups. And then there was a dictatorship in Greece, from the so-called the dictatorship of the Black Colonies from 68 through 74, which the brotherhoods embraced completely and endorsed with their own theology. There were theologians who collaborated with the dictatorship, like, for example, Panayotis Christou, a prominent patrologist in Thessaloniki. He established basically the theological school at the University of Thessaloniki. And he became even the Minister of Religion and Education under the dictatorship. And he was a very convinced he was on the side of dictatorship. Then after the dictatorship failed, there was a new era, and political theology flourished. For example, Yanaras, this guy, right? Yanaras, after the dictatorship, wrote every week almost an op-ed for a national newspaper, Bima. And his articles there were the articles of political theology. Then he combined them into a book, which is called, which he titled Takefale της πολιτικής theologias, the chapters of political theology. Even though he did not, and actually in the preface to this book, well, the preface is the most interesting part of the book, his kind of foreword. In the preface, he exactly stated political theology cannot exist. It just, you know, it's just a perversion, you know. But he titled the book The Chapters of Political Theology. So he wrote in this newspaper, Bima, articles which were published then as a single volume, the Chapters of Political Theology, articles criticizing the dictatorship, the role of the church in the dictatorship, and trying to create new paths for the church in the period after the dictatorship. So he tried to kind of describe a new liberal order for Greece. Of course, he ended up on a different tune. Later, like in the last part of his life, he continued writing op-eds for the newspaper, but this time it was Kathimerini, even better. And it's really the best. It's like New York Times of Greece. And he wrote almost like every Sunday, every week, an op-ed. In one of those op-eds, of those articles in 2008, soon after the invasion of Georgia happened by Russians, he wrote an article which really struck me. The title of the article is "We Need an Imagined Greek Putin," where he argued that the ideal model for the Greek society to flourish is to have their own Putin, to get rid of the parties, to get rid of the trade unions, and to establish a system like in Russia. So imagine the guy who criticized everything totalitarian in the period, you know, of after the World War II. He became like he wrote this the Ethos of Liberation, this famous kind of the most famous book, which is very much loved in the West. I don't like it very much, but anyways, and ended up in this way to invite Putin actually to rule, you know, Greece. After the big war started, he wrote about everything except the elephant in the room, he never wrote a piece about the war, never criticized anything about the war. That was a kind of fiasco of this kind of, I believe, of this political theology. But there were some theologians like this one, Father John Romanidis, also a prominent figure. He is credited for inventing kind of a new post, I don't know, post what, modern Greek theology. In the sense, he introduced this idea of Romiosini, Romanitas. He basically argued that the Greek identity of the Greek nation is like a very significant reduction of what we are as Greeks. The same Yanaras actually argued for. Yanaras believed that the Greek microstate is so small, it cannot, incarnate the spirit of Byzantium, of Hellenism, of true Hellenism. That's why he envisaged like big states as more embodying this spirit. We once it was 2007, Yanaras, Patriarch Bartholomew, Kirill, at the time Metropolitan of Moscow, and me, we went to Cappadocia together. So we had several days together, and we had, interesting encounters and conversations. And I remember Yanaras telling us that he believes that Turkey is much more the embodiment of the spirit of Byzantium than modern Greece. It's a complete anathema for Greece. If you say this in Greece, you get killed immediately, right? But he was, he was bold enough to say this. So for him, modern Greece was very small, and he looked into Turkey and even better Russia to be this empire, to be driven by the Orthodox ideas. Romanidis was very similar. He was very critical of the modern Greek identity, and he tried to substitute modern Greek identity, which they kind of diminishingly called Elladitismos, not Hellenismos, Elladitismos. Hellenismos is Hellenism, right? It's the big civilization. Elladitismos has to do with Hellas, Ellada, small Greek state. It's like the small Greek state ideology, and they all criticized this ideology, and they wanted to envisage something bigger. But in contrast to Yanaras, Romanidis, Yanaras was very critical about dictatorship, like the junta of the colonists, of the black colonists, right? And that's why he wrote his chapters of political theology in order to criticize the junta. Romanidis liked it. Moreover, there were some movements after the fall of the dictatorship in '74, political movements that wanted the restoration of dictatorship. Romanidis spearheaded those movements. He even wanted to be elected to the Greek parliament from those movements. So this is a sort of yes, and in this sense, if we remember those two tracks, Romanidis is track number 1, Yanaras is track number 2, right, in political theology. So Romanidis is more nationalistic, more anti-ecumenical. He was quite anti-ecumenical. Romanidis, quite anti-Catholic, right? Yanaras is different, and he certainly, Yanaras belongs to track number 2. And then in the same track number 2, I would place Father Alexander Shmema. Yes, again, he was he would never call himself a political theologian, no doubt, but he was a political theologian. Well, I would say he was really an ideologist. He's produced a very decent ideology, and his Eucharistic ecclesiology is, for me, I read it as a statement of political theology. Then let's go back to these guys, particularly to Kirill. So how this symphony happened? Because Kirill has produced a decent political theology. I would say he's the kind of the father of the postmodern Orthodox political theology. Me, myself, I started in patristics. I was always in patristics, like my field. Kirill also started in patristics. He taught patristics in Leningrad Theological Academy as a professor. Well, very short period of time. He was never trained in patristics, but no one was supposed to be trained in theology to teach in theological academies at the time. And then Kirill moved to these kind of political and social ideas. I remember this, and it inspired me personally, I should say. And certainly his ideology, the Russian world, what he called, it is his name, Russian world ideology is a political theology, and it is almost completely his construct. And how this ideology has happened. The ideology which I found this caricature quite telling about this. It is almost like the representation of this ideology. You see Kirill himself with Z instead of cross. Above him is Stalin, and above Stalin is Putin, with the crown of the Byzantine Basilevses and Russian Tsars. So this is a political theology, right? Russian world, and how this has happened. Surprisingly, it is a synthesis. It is not just the continuation of the fascist political theologies of the 30s. Kirill never, I know, Kirill never read Kreinik and other fascist theologians, right? Because they were not fashionable, they were not translated, they were not read, across the Russian world. He read Schmemann. He was fascinated by Avorides. He was fascinated by the best guys, from this theology of aggiornamento. Kirill himself is a theologian of aggiornamento. So this sort of political theology is a result of the synthesis of the kind of theology of the 30s and the theology of the 60s or 20s, with a more emphatic presence of the theology of aggiornamento in this theology. This is a paradox. Kirill believes in personalism, the same personalism that drove Yanaras or Zizioulas. Zizioulas was another prominent personalist, which is another topic. To what extent Zizioulas was a political theologian, another guy who declared himself completely apolitical. But I mean, he was a personalist. And personalism was a system of ideas that emerged mostly in the liberal French milieu, like in France after the World War I. Then it was embraced after the World War II in order to deal with the totalitarian ideologies, which were against the individual personhood, right? So the idea of personhood was promoted exactly to tackle the mass ideologies, the ideology of the masses, either in Nazism or in communism. So it was a very good thing. And then Kirill comes, a very fervent believer in personalism, the guy who, and personalism is another thing. Personalism, the Orthodox, we believe that it is our identity, personalism. That's how we are different from the West, because the West is anti-personalistic, it's essentialist, right? And we, the Orthodox, are personalists, even though personalism was invented in the West, particularly in the Catholic. Well, the Methodists also contributed to it, mostly in the United States. But the European continental personalism was Catholic primarily. So, and then Yanaras and Zizioulas, they all come, and Kirill after them, they all come and say, look, personalism is ours. We believe in persona, that it is more important than essence, than ousia. And that's what makes us different from the West. And Kirill transformed this personalism into his anti-Western ideology. He says, we in Orthodoxy, we stand for persona. That's why we need to fight the West. And so he does. But it has a very convenient political implication, because if you are a personalist, if you believe in persona, and the name of that persona is Vladimir Putin, then that persona is exempted, is beyond the essence of any political system, any political institution, be it a parliament, be it like the court, whatever. Then it is this Byzantine principle of empsychos nomos. The Basilevs, the king, as the ensouled law, the law which is above the laws. Or as Louis XIV said, l'état c'est moi. Well, Kirill also is a personalist, and he applies this to himself, and he would say, l'église c'est moi. Well, for him, he is the church. Which is personalistic, because, as a persona, I'm not bound by any institution, but by any essentialist kind of thing, which makes me an absolute ruler. And that's how Putin has happened, and how Kirill has happened as a church leader. So we have this paradox when a very good theology that began with Vladimir Solovyov, continued with, I don't know, with Bulgakov, Vladimir Losky, then Schmemann, even Schmemann, then it ended up here. It's not fascist ideology, fascist theology of the 30s. It's the result of this kind of very liberal theology. And again, I'm in the theology of the 60s. It's my theology, it's my home. But I just observe that here it ended, and this is a paradox. I'd like to leave this paradox with you to resolve. And this will be my my presentation for now.
Thank you very much. So we've got about half an hour for questions.
Sorry to interrupt.
Sure. So yeah, we've got about half an hour for questions, comments. So open to the floor or anyone online. Oh yeah, Daniel, did you want to go first?
I will probably need to close my presentation to make it video, right?
That might be, yeah.
Yeah.
Are you on
You want to
mute?
just disconnect your computer from the
Oh, maybe so, yeah.
Minute, just here. So
Yeah.
now, do you hear me?
Yes.
Great, great. Yeah. Thank you for a fascinating presentation. And I have, I think, even two questions about it. First is, when the Patriarch Kirill, he called Putin, as it's known now, an archistrategos, as Archangel Michael's. Can you explain this from theological point of view, or it's the same paradox?
Well, of course it's nonsense, and of course it's purely like flattering. And I mean, of course, when Kirill says it, he doesn't believe it. Sometimes, people ask me, is it true that Kirill believes what he says? And my answer is usually, he's believing it when he's saying it, not immediately afterwards or before that. So of course, when he is saying that Putin is something, he's believing the moment he's saying, but not the next moment after that. Kirill believes personally that Putin is like a mediocre accident, in the Russian history. He believes that, I remember very much the kind of one of the halves of the brain of Kirill, Father Vsevolod Chaplin, who passed away sometime, was really was a very prominent figure and thinker who inspired Kirill to a great extent. I believe Chaplin, who started really as a super liberal, very prominent, very open-minded, very ecumenical, and ended up as a fascist, basically, one of the fathers of the Russian fascist ideology. So Chaplin used to say, those guys in the Kremlin, they're stupid. They don't understand things. We can do much better than they do. He believed that, and Kirill believes the same. So he believes that he is much smarter than Putin. And when it's said famously that after the conversation with Kirill, look, you are like altar boy of Putin. This really upset Kirill. He was absolutely upset. After that, he just stopped any communication with the Vatican. It was a personal insult because Kirill believes that it is Putin who is altar boy. Just the way way around. And that's something that Francis didn't get about, their symphony. Yes, Kirill believes that he's smarter. Kirill believes that he is much better than Putin. He believes that an ideal regime for Russia would be Ayatollahsm, basically, theocracy. Of course, with him playing the key role in this theocracy, no doubt, it's not for anyone else. But he has to tolerate Putin, basically. So whatever he says about Putin is just the way to protect himself. He tolerates Putin, and Putin tolerates Kirill as well. They don't love each other. And I say that sometimes that their relationship is not a marriage of love, it's a marriage of convenience. They need each other. And as long as they need each other, they stick to each other. But it's always it's very pragmatic, it's very calculating on both sides to have this relationship.
Yeah, thank you so much. And the second question is, this idea of how the dictatorship, idea of dictatorship emerged from liberalism. It made me recall Gaddafi's idea of Jamahiriya, which emerged as Islamic Republic. But since he just, in fact, entrusted the local affairs to people, but all higher affairs, he gave it to the control of military guards, it gradually evolved into a personalist dictatorship.
Yeah.
Do you see any parallels with this idea?
I do, yes, absolutely. The same as in Iran. With they also started as a republic, as a very egalitarian society, right? Anti-Shah, the anti-Shah spirit of the republic was also the spirit of rejecting all those old hierarchies, and where they end up now, when it is not the republic who chooses the new ayatollah. It's kind of the guards of the revolution, which have usurped power basically against all other. They disregard the president, the presidential office, and so forth. That's how all those kind of dictatorships that start with very egalitarian attitude eventually, but not all of them maybe, but some of them. Certainly it's Iran, and certainly it's Kirill's story. It's absolutely so. Yeah, they start, and Putin. I mean, Putin was very much anti-Soviet and anti-communist at least. He became really disappointed in ideology. I think he sincerely became disappointed in the communist ideology, and he doesn't want the Soviet Union to be back. Well, again, in contrast to the popular belief, he wants really a synthesis. Well, that's another thing. Is the big question what he wants. He is told to what to want, basically, and I believe that is the job of Kirill. He actually tells Putin what to believe, what to accept. Before Kirill, I think Putin was unable to think big. This ability came to him from Kirill. Kirill thinks in the cosmic terms, in the civilizational terms. And eventually Putin, was forced to adopt his language and started speaking the same language. And this is the language of this kind of Russian civilization, the fight against, the global West and the United States at the core of this. This is their belief now. I don't believe Putin ever believed what he's saying now. Now he believes it, and this, I think, this is the influence of Kirill and other ideologists.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay, Jonathan.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, fascinating. It was as depressing as it was at many points. It was also fun to be reminded of so many kind of old theological friends. And it makes me wonder. What do you see, or who do you see as the kind of resources within Orthodox traditions? What be they Greek, Russian diaspora, as antidotes to some of this kind of entropy toward fascism or entropy toward totalitarianism? I'm thinking of maybe like a Pavel Florensky as an example, or even within the personalist tradition. I mean, and I'd love to probe further this kind of connection that you drew at the end, like personalism to that. I didn't quite follow, but like, what do you see as some of the resources for as antidotes to this? And is it back to Shmeiman?
Well, it's certainly not Florensky. This war urges us to reconsider many postulates and dogmas that we held, about those prominent figures. We now discovered Florensky was a Trotskyist. He was a big friend of Leo Trotsky.
Okay.
And so what?
But I'm serious in that. Like, does that?
Yeah, I mean, he was really. If we see, well, that's why Florensky was quite different from Bulgakov, for example. For instance, Florensky, and again, Florensky. Yeah, we could see Florensky as someone who was kind of killed for being a priest or a Christian, but for the Soviets, he was killed as a Trotskyist. He was, for example, he became really a friend of Trotsky. Trotsky at the time was the head of the terror, of the Soviet terror. He was not just, he was not yet the person in exile. He was still in power. He was the head of the Red Army at the time. And Florensky was his buddy, So it's just a remark about Florensky. But speaking about the resources, I believe there are resources in our tradition, honestly. We started discovering those, or recovering those resources. I believe it is the entire non-conformist tradition in Orthodoxy, which is embodied in monasticism, for example. I believe Athanasius the Great could be a great resource, as opposing to Eusebius. My point is that yes, this Eusebian line in the political theology, in Orthodox political theology, needs to be revised. And the alternative to the Eusebian line was Athanasius, who produced this kind of parallel vita. Well, while Eusebius produced this Vita Constantini, Athanasius produced Vita Antonii as an alternative political theology. Look, it's our model is not, his point was, our model is not Constantine, as you Eusebius say. Our model is Antonius of Egypt. Of course, he could not criticize openly the emperors, even though he did it in the case of Constans II, but it's Athanasius, or Maximus the Confessor, for example, or who was exiled as traitor, for criticizing the state for crossing the red line between the church and the state in the symphony, or Photius to some extent. Photius was very cautious. He didn't want to end up as Maximus, of course, and that's why he had to watch his tongue and to be very cautious. But he was about keeping the borderlines between the church and the state. Or Gregory Palamas as another resource, I believe, well, it's certainly the Athonite monasticism, for example, for me, because the Athonite monasticism is a betrayal, is a betrayal of original monasticism for me, because the Athonite monasticism was established and promoted when the church, after the iconoclast crisis, realized that monasticism is really a threat to the state, because monasticism contested the iconoclast policies of the state. Then the state started investing, recreating monasticism which would be loyal. That's how the Athonite monasticism emerged, as loyal monasticism of the kind of royal highnesses, and that's why Athonite monasticism is very anti-nonconformist, very different from the Egyptian monasticism or Syriac monasticism. But that's a different story. So, anyways, monasticism is another resource for this kind of political theology. And then the 20th century, as I mentioned, yes, Solovyov. Why not? Berdyaev, Bulgakov. Of course, we always have to take, now in Ukraine, we don't trust Russians, whomever. But, and for us, Russians have lost their presumption of innocence, as it were. They need to prove that they are good. So I think there are some Russians who can prove that they are good. And we can find a lot of things good in Bulgakov and I believe in Losky and stuff. They could be wrong in some other points of political theology. Anyway, so yeah, the war forces us to really rediscover political theology. It's a new chapter, completely new chapter for political theology. It's just we just started writing it.
Muriel, thanks for that. I've heard about Alexander Dugin, and I've heard that he is greatly influencing Kirill and Putin. So my question is, how much do you think they're drawing on Alexander Dugin's ideas?
Almost nothing. I believe it's a very popular Western misconcept to consider Dugin as the main ideologist. Dugin. The problem with Dugin is so complicated. You cannot really grasp what he wants to say. The problem that even himself, he can't grasp what he wants to say. He's complicated to himself. I was recently approached by the Brill. They are setting up a volume, collective volume, where the scholars try to conceptualize Dugin. So they asked me to write a preface to that volume. I did. And I basically argue that you guys, you are inventing Dugin. It's kind of a constructed Dugin, which has a little to do with the original one. Dugin appeals, when he is kind of constructed in this way, he can be interesting in the West, and in the West people would say, well, this is probably what the Russian ideology is about, even though it's not. The deep people, what they call the deep people of Russia, average Russians, would be unable whatsoever to comprehend a hint in Dugin. I follow him on Telegram. He has only like maybe a dozen or a couple of dozens of followers on Telegram. That is the kind of number of Russians who can comprehend him, of all millions, right? Of course, well, I don't think Putin bothers to read Dugin or whatever. Of course, he knows probably. Well, he knows about Dugin because his daughter was killed. But otherwise, no, I would not over exaggerate and overestimate his influence. He has more influence in the West than in Russia. He's quite right, I believe, in grasping what is Trumpism. That's another thing. He has become a very kind of vocal advocate for Trumpism. And he's right. I agree with some points of Dugin. In which point? For example, he argues, he's recently published a book, 2025, about the ideology of Trump. And he argues basically that in the first term, Trump failed to produce any ideology. He relied on the crazy people like QAnon and those movements, but he never produced an ideology. Now, in the second term, he started producing ideology, and Dugin is quite good in articulating this ideology of Trumpism, probably better than Trumpist ideologies, in articulating the ideology, which is kind of a different question. What is Trumpism? And well, of course, Trump would not understand a word in Trumpism. But there is such a thing as Trump has created his name by people like J.D. Vance and the assembly of other intellectuals who try to kind of articulate these ideas. And Dugin is quite good in grasping those ideas. He will maybe he could immigrate to the U.S. To the Heritage Foundation or wherever to help them to articulate Trumpism better than they do.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very interesting presentation. I enjoyed it. It's just a question like political theology. I love the way you started up that it's a ghost in the sense that it hasn't been, but there have been serious political decisions made. For example, the granting of Ukrainian independence from the Russian church. Like that's surely an event of political ramifications. But is that not also part of Orthodox political theology? Because it is and shows how the church can influence the state, so because some people would argue that it was the granting of independence to the Ukraine Orthodox Church that has forced Russian church to act in some ways, or to get some more influence. So in terms of the political theology that you see as this goes bigger, where does it sit in this bigger picture of what's happening?
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent question. And let me bring back the presentation if I could, because I wanted to illustrate my answer by this presentation. This one. So yes, we in Ukraine, I believe we develop our own distinct Ukrainian theology, political theology. But we tend to call it Ukrainian public theology more than political theology. Actually, by we, I mean myself. That's kind of my job. Yes. But I argue that in Ukraine, public theology is more important for us than political theology. Because in Ukraine, especially following the Maidans, society is more powerful, is stronger than the state. In the Maidans, there was this clash between the state and the society, and the society won in both Maidans, 2003-4/4, 2013/14. And the church, which always looks for the real centers of power, realized that the state is weaker, the society is stronger, so we need to go with the society, which is good. It's not because the church had those kind of pure intentions. It's because the church was smart enough to realize that the society is better to be related to than the state. Well, the kind of established churches, especially the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which was established by the Thomas of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, really still considers the state as its main partner. This is the tendency, unfortunately. But if we're talking about the general situation in the society, political theologians or public theologians who reflect, elaborate on this situation, who belong to different traditions, including Greek Catholics. Greek Catholics are especially prominent. Now evangelicals are quite good. They developed the theology of citizenship. I helped them actually to develop. They hired me to teach at the seminary, evangelical seminary in Kiev. So I see like in different traditions, confessions, the same synoptic outlook emerges that the society is more important than the state. and they developed what I call public theology, Ukrainian public theology. In contrast to Russia, where I believe public theology just doesn't exist. They try to establish some things. Like, for example, in the institution where I worked, it was the Russian postgraduate and doctoral school of Cyril and Methodius, run by Hilarion Orfeev, by the way. He was the rector, I was the vice rector of that school. And they tried to establish some kind of public theology, to run some public theology. And it inevitably ended up in political theology, basically studying the church and the state, because the state is everything in Russia. The society, well, they now speak about the emergence of the civil society in Russia, but the civil society it's like the Victor Frankenstein's monster, basically. It is obedient to Victor Frankenstein, to the state. It is allowed to exist within the framework of supporting Putin's war and Putin himself. If you support them, you can be called civil society, and then you have kind of discussions within. But if you go against, you are the enemy of the state. You cannot be a part of the civil society. So the Russian church has kind of relationship with the state, and this kind of imitation of the civil society, which is very pro-Putin and which they call civil society in Russia. But basically, it's not public theology that they develop. They can develop so far only political theology based on this church-state relations. In contrast, again, to Ukraine, where really, I believe, genuine public theology is emerging.
Well, maybe I was thinking similarly along Jonathan's lines, just pushing that point a little bit more about how does it move from this kind of progressive personalist theology into this close alignment with the state? Like, what are some of the steps there that happen, that move?
Yes, I believe it was because they took from the previous traditions of political theology some elements that fit their agenda, like anti-Westernism. Like, yes, well, for example, take George Florovsky. Well, George Florovsky was not a fascist. I think like 99%. But certainly he was anti-Western, very much anti-Western. He certainly created like this attitude of pseudomorphosis, that you have to preserve your purest orthodoxy, purest Orthodox identity. And for that, you need to be yourself, of course, but then you need to oppose others. If you look into the rhetoric of Kirill or even Putin, they say that we are fighting for the purity of orthodoxy. For example, they sometimes explain the war in Ukraine. They say Ukraine has betrayed orthodoxy. It has become Uniate. It has become Catholic. The commonest accusation against me, as I read, I enjoy reading what they write about me in Russia. So the most common way to present me in Russia is I'm a Uniate, they say, because, you know, I am polluting this purist orthodoxy by engaging with the West. I am a Uniate, and they say sometimes, the entire Ukrainian project is a Uniate project. Therefore, you need to get rid of it. Mm-hmm. You just need to eliminate it. Mm-hmm. As they fight Uniatism, they now fight Ukraine. Those two things are now combined. This is the way how they think. It comes from Florovsky. I mean, it coheres from Florovsky. It's not that Florovsky would endorse this, even though sometimes I wonder on which side he would have been if really. Because so many good people turned to the wrong side, whom I knew. But certainly it correlates with his ideas of pseudomorphosis, right? So then personalism. Personalism is excellent, is good. I was, and maybe I am to some extent a personalist myself to now, but the political implications of personalism, I just mentioned them. Personalism leads you, it's like a shortcut to the personalistic rule. Absolutist personalistic rule could be. As it was in South Vietnam, for example, in the 60s, with this personalistic party of this dictator who ruled South Vietnam, and he was a personalist, a Christian Catholic personalist.
Mm. Can I ask you to clarify what you mean by personalism? Because I'm actually having a hard time recognizing it at this point.
Yeah. So personalism basically states that personhood is more important than anything else. Personhood is the quintessence of the human being.
Right.
That it is like the image of God par excellence in us. That it is unique. It is it encompasses freedom. It is kind of they are synonymous, freedom and personhood. That it is bigger than the essence, the nature, what they call the nature. Nature meaning everything which is kind of we share in commonality, and personhood is something that that makes us unique. And originally, as I said, it emerged against those ideologies of masses that stated that masses are more important than individuals. No. And it is rooted in the Trinity, of course, because the hypostasis of the Trinity, they are like the prototypes, the archetypes of our personhood. In Zizoulas, it led, of course, to the distortion of Trinity, to the extent that he basically implied that the persons of the Trinity are higher than the essence of the Trinity, which is heretical. In our kind of case, it means that our personalities are more important than our essence, and well, that's how it is, I think. Would you recognize this?
Yes and no.
Mhm.
So when I read Zizoulas, I mean, I understand that he can be taken in that direction. I think he actually does stop short of the heretical move. And I know that it's rooted in the kind of de Ragnon thesis that, you know, this is the East prioritizes the person over the essence, the West the essence over the persons, et cetera, which is mostly historically bunk, but
Of course.
and that's fine. But actually, when I read Zizoulas or Mansaridis or Yanaras or others on personhood, what's central to it is not simply the binary personhood equals freedom, nature equals
Unfreedom,
unfreedom or necessity. Though that is a possible implication, but actually that personhood is over against a kind of monadism. That personhood is defined.
Yes, it's a relational. Yes, it's
and
relational.
that to me is so key to it that I find it hard to imagine how you go from, and maybe it's just a really bad reading of them that these people do it. That's entirely possible.
Mhm.
But when you take someone like Zizoulas seriously or Jan Ross in Person and Eros, I mean, I've only read his works translated in English, so obviously less up here, but relationality being so central to this.
True.
And prior to any kind of individual standing out, that it's hard to imagine how you end up with like the persona of the dictator. In a way, like that seems so at odds with what they're going for. And maybe maybe all of this is true at once. Like you get a certain kind of this and it ends up with Putin.
I agree with you. Yes, the relationship is very important to the personhood, to the personalism of Yanaras or Zizoulas, indeed. To the extent that they believe that our personalities are kind of formed by our relationships.
Precisely so. Yeah,
Yes?
ecstatic
Right.
fundamentally.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's why it's another eclectic reading of person.
Gotcha.
Yes, of course. Just like it is eclectic reading of Florovsky, who was a personalist himself as well. Right?
Sure.
And the same is the eclectic reading of personalists. But I mean, and again, one of the points which are kind of super emphasized in those ideas, liberal ideas of the past of the 20th century, is this anti-Westernism. Because again, it's like a by-side comment for them that yes, by the way, we are the personalists, the true personalists, and the West is essentialist, right? But Kirill has made it the central point of his discussion, anti-Westernism, all right? And then again, yes, this relationism, which is pertinent to personalism, is almost forgotten in Kirill's interpretation and by others.
Thank you. That is so clarifying.
And this is a very good point. Yeah, thank you for reminding about this. Yeah.
Just feel bad having good people like Zizoulas end up feeling complicit in something like
Well,
this.
honestly, I don't like Zizoulas, but I think he was heretical in his Trinitarian views because he just
ended up there.
plays
You're right.
recreated the hierarchy of the persons
Yeah.
in the Trinity, and he overemphasized persons over essence, something that
He ended up all the way in.
completely anti-Cappadocian.
And you say a bit more about Losky, because he made a lot of the de Ragnon thing.
Mhm.
But from what you said in passing, it sounded like you would put him in the second track, the sort of.
It's interesting. I believe Kirill read Losky more than anyone else of all these kind of guys. And Losky is the same story, anti-Western, and not to the extent of Florovsky, of course, more moderate, but still anti-Western. And again, this idea that Yes, we in the East, we are for the personhood, and unlike in contrast to those who are in the West.
That's how I use that. So with your two tracks, it's really the dialectic and the wobbles between the tracks and the porosity between the tracks.
Exactly.
The important thing. Yeah.
So basically, yeah, my point, what I wanted to say, that this modern political theology of the Russian world of Kirill is not just a continuation of the fascist theologies of the 30s. The paradox, they didn't read those guys. Like I read Krajnik, I read those fascist theologians. Kirill never did this. But all of a sudden he emerged so coherent with them on the basis of what he read, which was exactly this aggiornamento political theology.
I'm there's beginnings of a thought, but I can't. I'm fascinated that there seems to be a parallel or resonance between analogous moves are in Catholic theology. I'm thinking of de Lubac, and his move after the council, having provided the theology that fed into the council. And the thing that I'm trying to tease out is in de Lubac and other resourceful theologians, there's a fascination with opposition and difference, which you also then also see in Bulgakov, Florensky. You've got this, and it can wobble in a liberal direction, but also in a conservative direction.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether there's something there about.
Yeah, as it was the case of Panayotis Christou, for example, because Panayotis Christou was the Greek founder of resourceman. He is about resourceman. He was Palamas scholar, primarily, by the way, and he yes, he used this resourceman in a completely different direction to support dictatorship. And he basically said, because Palamas was anti-Western, bro. At least at that time they believed he was anti-Western. Now we not know much more about him, that he was not so anti-West.
Yeah.
You know, but at least Christou promoted him as such, and they used this kind of patristics in order to, just like Florovsky. I believe Florovsky used patristics heavily for his ideological agenda.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Anyone online who wanted to ask anything? Or anyone else in the room with any other questions? Just very last, so just that personalist essentialist thing is part of the implication of your argument that if you, like Philip's indicating, kind of go one direction too far, you emphasize relationality in a kind of general way, but then you lose the essential dignity of the human person, the kind of that metaphysics of the human person, etc.
Which is another interesting thing, dignity and human rights, another kind of dichotomy that they employ. Kirill is the author of this document, which is called the Teaching of the Russian Church of Human Dignity and Human Rights. I was a part of the working group of that document. I saw the dynamics of the discussions. This document basically states that human rights is unchristian, it's wrong, and it's West because it's Western, right? And instead, he promoted the idea of dignity, of the human dignity. Basically, it means that if you work hard enough to get your dignity, you can be respected as a human being. If you don't deserve any respect. And this ends up. This is the gist of the document. So human rights is a Western design that destroys the Western civilization. Christianity, it's against Christianity. So it needs to be rejected. What instead we promote is the idea of dignity. The paradox of course, of this, if you advocate for dignity in this way, you end up in the situation of the war, the way how they treat, for example, our prisoners of war. It's so against basics of dignity. It's just the deprivation. Everything they do in Russia is to deprive a human being of any dignity. That's kind of the method. And it's based on this theology. So the theology of affirmation of dignity against human rights leads you to complete negation of human dignity whatsoever in reality. So that's kind of another aspect to the story.
Yeah, it's a scary one, that's for sure. Well, thanks very much. That was so rich, gave us a real insight into political theology and public theology, and kind of across centuries, but then into the modern period. So just very grateful for your time and offering yourself here to us to talk about these ideas. So thanks very much.
Inviting me here.
No problem, and enjoy lunch too. So
Very well,
thanks.
Thank you. Will you share this recording?
Yeah.